This is Charles Fairbanks. Everybody say hi, Charles. Charles was the Republican nominee for vice president in 1904, an election which he won. He served as vice president from 1905 to 1909. He would again seek the vice presidency in 1916 as the Republican nominee. Charles lost that election to this guy, Democratic nominee and incumbent Vice President Thomas Marshall. What do these two have in common? They were both from my home state of Indiana. As a matter of fact, Indiana was a popular place for vice presidential nominees in this time. In the 13 presidential elections between 1868 and 1916, 10 featured at least one person on a major party ticket from Indiana. Of those, the only presidential candidate was Benjamin Harrison. Schuyler Colfax in 1868, Thomas Hendricks in 1876, William English in 1880, Hendricks again in 1884, our buddy Charles in 1904, John Kern in 1908, Marshall in 1912, and both Charles and Marshall in 1916 were all VP nominees from Indiana. So why were both parties running people from a relatively insignificant state for vice president during this time? Because Indiana was a swing state. Despite Indiana being one of the most solidly Republican states in the country today, it used to be a crucial swing state. Because of the Electoral College, a handful of states are always the most important in determining who will win the presidential elections. These states change over time, so I created this grid. This shows how every state voted in every single presidential election. For example, here is Indiana during the late 1800s and early 1900s, swinging frequently from Democrat to Republican. This chart helps us see a lot of interesting information. You can clearly see landslide elections, like 1984 for the Republican Ronald Reagan, or 1936 for the Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. You can see which states voted solidly one way for a long period of time, like Vermont voting Republican 27 elections in a row, or Minnesota voting Democrat in the last 13 elections. You can see changes in political parties, like the split of the old Democratic Republicans in the 1820s and the collapse of the Whig Party in the 1850s. You can even see notable third-party showings, like John Bell's Constitutional Union Party in 1860, and George Wallace's segregationist American Independence Party in 1968. However, we are going to use this grid to find which states have been swing states in U.S. history. I'm defining a clear swing state as a state that switches the party it votes for at least 3 times in a 5-election period within one party system. This is totally arbitrary, but it cancels out states that only switch during big swing elections and the chaos that happens when party systems change. Here are the dates for each party system in U.S. history that I'm using. You can learn more about U.S. party systems with this video by Bay State History. With that said, let's get into the first political party system. After the end of Washington's presidency, the U.S. immediately divided into a clear 2-party system. Hamilton's Federalists, who favored a strong central government and are shown here in green, and Jefferson's Republicans, which we now call the Democratic Republicans, who generally favored more power residing in the states and are shown here in teal. During this era, the Democratic Republicans won every election after 1800 and faced no real opposition after 1816. There are a few states that fit my definition of a swing state. New Jersey went Federalist for John Adams, switched to the Democratic Republicans for the 1804 and 1808 elections, switched back to the Federalists in 1812, and went Democratic Republican the rest of the way. You can tell the only later election where the Federalists got close to winning was 1812, where DeWitt Clinton nearly beat James Madison due to the unpopularity of the War of 1812. The other states that fit our definition of a swing state were New Hampshire and Rhode Island. They both supported John Adams in 1796 and 1800, switched to the Democratic Republicans in 1804, swung back to Federalist in 1808 and 1812, and then voted Democratic Republican. While these states were swinging back and forth, they weren't really deciding elections, since the Federalists kept losing. The one state that did do that was Maryland, which supported the Federalists in 1796, was evenly split in 1800, and voted Democratic-Republican from there on. It is important to note that in these early years, the Electoral College didn't really work the way it does today, and sometimes states would give electoral votes to multiple different candidates. You can see this by these circles on the map of the election of 1800. Alright, let's move on to the second party system, where Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren's Democratic Party, which are shown here in blue, faced the National Republican and later Whig parties, which were led by figures like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. The main division of this time was how people felt about Jackson himself, with the National Republicans and Whigs often described as anti-Jacksonian parties. 3 states in this era were the most important swing states. Pennsylvania, New York, and Louisiana each voted Democrat early on for Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, swung to the Whigs in 1840, swung back to the Democrats in 1844, back to the Whigs in 1848, and back to the Democrats for 1852. In 5 elections, they swung every single election. These 3 states were crucial to the 2 Whig victories in this era, in 1840 when William Henry Harrison won, and in 1848 when Zachary Taylor won. Both of these elected Whigs later died in office. Georgia would also fit the swing state definition, but it went for the Whigs in 1836 as well. There were a few other states that were kind of swing states in this era, particularly Maine, but also Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Jersey. They each supported the National Republicans at one point, went Democrat, then Whig, then back to the Democrats at different times. The collapse of the Whigs in the 1850s brought about the third party system, which saw the emergence of the anti-slavery Republican Party led by Abraham Lincoln. They are shown in red, though the party colors were not so defined until the 1990s. The Democrats remained and became the party defending slavery. After the Civil War, the Democrats would continue to be the most popular party in the South. The Republicans won nearly every election they ran for president in the first 75 years of the party's existence. The 3 exceptions in the third party system are Buchanan's victory in 1856 and Grover Cleveland's victories in 1884 and 1892. Also note that in 1860, 3 states voted for the Constitutional Union Party, and there was a divide between Northern and Southern Democrats that I did not show on here. Also, some states did not vote in 1864 and 1868 due to the Civil War and Reconstruction. All of this to say, there were a few states that would swing back and forth. Early on, New Jersey was a swing state, typically voting Democrat, but helping Lincoln in 1860 and Grant in 1872. 2 southern states were also technically swing states, Tennessee and Virginia. They both voted Democrat in 1856, for the Constitutional Union ticket in 1860, then voted Republican once they were readmitted to the Union, before returning to the Democrats. The 2 most important swing states after the Civil War were New York and Indiana. Both of these states switched every election from 1872 to 1896. They went Republican in 1872, Democrat in 1876, which made that election very close, Republican in 1880, Democrat in 1884 to help Cleveland win his first term, back to Republican in 1888, back to Democrat for Cleveland in 1892, and back to the Republicans in 1896. This willingness to swing back and forth so consistently by Indiana and New York is basically unmatched in American history. It led to both parties nominating candidates from these states for president or vice president in the hopes of carrying their home state. There were 13 elections between 1868 and 1916, which means there were 52 total nominees for president and vice president. Of those 52 nominees, 27 were from either New York or Indiana. If we add in the nominees from Ohio, we see that a vast majority of national candidates at the time came from just 3 states. A few others also fit my definition of swing states in this era, including Connecticut, California, and Nevada. Nevada is interesting because it was one of the states that voted for the People's Party in 1892, a third party in the rural West that pushed for expansionary monetary policy and opposed the gold standard. These ideas would be absorbed by the Democratic Party, which led to the fourth party system, stretching from the 1890s until 1932. The fourth party system can be difficult to define, but saw the Democrats under leaders like William Jennings Bryan lose a bunch, while Republican presidents like William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt embraced imperialism and progressivism and then returned to normalcy under Harding and Calvin Coolidge. You can see on the chart that Woodrow Wilson's victory in 1912 came due to many Republicans switching to vote for Roosevelt's Progressive Party, thus splitting the Republican vote. There were fewer states regularly swinging back and forth in this era. Tennessee and Oklahoma were both consistent Democrat states that swung for the Republicans in 1920 and 1928, but the Republicans won in 1924 without them. The elections in this era were decided by a chunk of states that would usually vote Republican in the 1900s, voted Democrat in the 1910s, and mostly returned to the Republicans in the 1920s. Those states were New Hampshire, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and expansion states New Mexico and Arizona. These states decided the elections in the fourth party system. Finally, a few states technically count as swing states by my definition because they voted for the Progressive Party once. Washington, California, and Wisconsin each voted for the Republicans, Democrats, and Progressives at least once. The fifth party system started in 1932 with the first election of Franklin D. Roosevelt and lasted until sometime between the late 1960s and the early 1980s. This period saw Democrats unite in favor of FDR's New Deal programs, while Republicans focused on small government and social conservatism. Later in this period, civil rights would become an important issue, with many black voters leaving the Republican Party for the Democratic Party, and many segregationist Southerners leaving the Democrats for the Republicans. Most elections in this period were landslides, with FDR, Eisenhower, LBJ, and Nixon winning with large electoral college majorities. Some states did swing frequently, such as Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, and Wisconsin. These states usually voted Democrat in the first half of the era and Republican in the second half, but had one or two outliers. There were a few southern states that also fit the definition of swing states. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama typically voted Democrat, but voted for the states' rights Democratic Party, more commonly known as the Dixiecrat Party, in 1948, voted for Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964, and then voted for segregationist George Wallace's American Independence Party in 1968. After this period, these states would become reliably Republican. The closest election in this period was JFK's victory in 1960 over Richard Nixon. Several states helped JFK defeat Nixon in 1960 before voting for Nixon when he later ran in 1968. Those states would be Delaware, New Jersey, Nevada, Illinois, Missouri, New Mexico, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The sixth party system started sometime in the 1970s or 80s. Many political scientists and historians are now claiming it ended in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. In this period, the Republican Party became the party of Reagan, focusing on cultural conservatism and free markets, while the Democratic Party leaned further into the economic and social progressivism it had started developing in the previous decades. In the 1970s and 1980s, a few states served as swing states before moving clearly to one party's control. New York, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, and Hawaii swung back and forth in the 1970s and 1980s before becoming clear Democratic states. Georgia did as well and voted Democrat in 1992 before voting Republican for the next 2 decades. West Virginia is the most peculiar of these states, as it swung back and forth in the 1970s and 1980s before becoming a clear Democratic state through the 90s. However, starting in 2000, West Virginia has become a secure Republican state. Two states fit our definition of swing states because of the later part of this period: New Hampshire and Florida. New Hampshire voted Republican in the 1980s, Democrat in the 1990s, helped Bush win in 2000, and then returned to the Democrats. Florida voted Republican in the 80s and 1992, Democrat in 1996, for Bush in 2004, and then for Obama in 2008 and 2012. In fact, New Hampshire and Florida are two examples of an important group of states that also includes Ohio, Iowa, Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. These states each voted for Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama at least once. They were each considered critical battleground states for decades. Finally, the hotly debated seventh party system started in 2016. In the last decade, the Republicans have been the party of Trump, focusing primarily on issues like illegal immigration and protectionist trade policy. I would say the Democrats are still finding their footing in this era. Many want them to go in a more openly democratic socialist direction, while others want them to be more moderate. This will undoubtedly be the focus of the 2028 Democratic primary, so I'll hold off on categorizing them until a later date. There are 5 states that voted for Trump in 2016, Biden in 2020, and Trump in 2024. These are Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. If you add Nevada to this group, you get the swing states of the seventh party system, though this could obviously change as the parties and states continue to evolve. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I didn't record or plan an outro, which was poor planning on my part, but I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed my ramblings about the history of my home state. And I will leave you with one thing, which this is the gravesite of former Indiana president, former U.S. president from Indiana, Benjamin Harrison. Here at Crown Hill Cemetery, and he's buried with both of his wives. The Madman.